Okay, so let's look at today a couple of things with regards to this particular unit, which is health and social care, and this is a specialist unit that we are looking at covering. So if you give me just 1 second, what I also want to do is bring up the unit specification. So just give me 1 second. Okay, here we go. So just to share with you in terms of, my name is Raman Singh, and obviously looking at covering this particular unit, which is Learning Outcome 2 today. So I brought across, the health and social care sector, unit specification. The reason I've opened this up is I think we had a bit of a break in the middle because of the bank holidays. And the idea is to try and do a bit of a quick recap in terms of what we've covered so far when we did the first learning outcome, for this particular unit. Now, in the health and social care sector, as you know, this is a unit that we are studying primarily to, gain knowledge and increase our knowledge on, the health and social care sector in the UK in terms of, how the health and social care sector is structured, what are the key bodies, in terms of, let's look at Department of Health. We are looking at the National Health Service. We're looking at some of the key bodies and regulators like CQC. We are talking in terms of other bodies related to, working very closely and either maintaining, regulating, or, inspecting things, how they are delivered in terms of this sector providing health and social care services to people in the UK. So when we look at the health and social care sector in the UK, obviously it's a complex and an extensive network of services. When I say this, what I mean by that is this is an organization, or in general, an umbrella organization which is responsible for providing medical, nursing, social, and healthcare services to the members of public in the UK. Now, when we look at NHS, the National Health Service, there's nothing like the NHS in the world. It is a very, very, when we look at, let's put it this way, when I say we are a welfare state, so things like education, healthcare services are provided by the government. And when we look at these services being provided by the government, the healthcare service was set up in the 1951 after the World War II. And this basically is a cornerstone in terms of how the health and social care services are provided to members of public in the UK. Now, anybody who is a resident here, anybody who has indefinite leave to remain, should have access to all free health and social care services, from various outlets, hospitals, A&Es, surgeries, community centers, pharmacies, things like that. Now, what we do is when we look at the National Health Service and when we look at studying this particular unit, which is health and social care sector, what we are trying to do is understand the number and type and different organizations which are responsible for delivering these services to the members of public. Now, when we look at this unit again, there are 3 learning outcomes that we are going to be looking at broadly. The first one, last week when we covered this learning outcome, broadly we understood what is the structure of the health and social care sector. It is made up of, if some of you recall, things like the Department of Health. There is the Health Secretary, you have the NHS Constitution, you have CQC, which is the Care Quality Commission, which is regulator, and then underneath that you have the National Service, which is made up of clinical commissioning groups, PCCTs. It is made up of surgeries, local council bodies, and key regulating agencies and advisories, which include the National Institute of Care and Excellence. We have MHRA and a lot of other bodies which are there. Now, when we looked at this structure, we also went into the details of understanding who are the practitioners who work within or practitioners or people who work within this sector, what are their roles and responsibilities, and then why there is an importance placed on continuous professional development, training, and development in general within this particular sector. Now, we also, towards the end, looked at the distinction criteria, which was to look at evaluating the structure of a named health and social care organization within with this context of what we've understood in learning outcome 1. So we looked at an example of a care home, a GP surgery, wherein if you know the structure, the idea would be to explain that in a bit more detail. Now, in the second learning outcome, what we are looking at today is we are going to be focusing on what is called investigating how current legislation and professional codes of practice, help in regulation and delivery of quality services, quality health and social care services, if I may rephrase that, and the person-centered approach, integrated care approach, and that being set in mind, then delivery of these services to the members of the public. So here, the idea would be to understand what are the key legislations, what are the key, when I say key legislation, I mean laws and regulation which have to be applied within the health and social care sector in a particular health and social care setting. When we talk about care home, adult care home, we talk about a GP surgery, a community center, a pharmacy, any sort of a setting in which basically the members of public can receive health and social care services. We'll also be looking at UK care certificate standards, which are basically required to promote the best practices and the way in which services can be delivered to the members of public. And in the merit criteria, we are looking at relationship between what are called health values and care values. Now, there's a fair bit of content to be covered in this. We are looking at briefly through a presentation what are the current legislations, which are basically acts or laws which are created in the Parliament, and then they are implemented within the Department of Health by various agencies. We'll look at care certificate standards. We'll look at some of the bits related to how these services or best practices are incorporated into delivery of services by practitioners within the health and social care sector. Now, in order to discuss this learning outcome, what we've got is a bit of a presentation, and we'll go through some of the slides today to understand them in a bit more detail. So what we would want to cover is basically, first part is the legislation part. Now, when we look at the legislation, there are lots of different legislations, which are there within the health and social care sector. Now, if I put it in a context, this should be the first slide which I want to show you. And this slide, as you can see, talks about, the current legislations which are relevant to, the health and social care sector. So when we talk about legislation in terms of, act, what is the meaning of the word legislation? So when we say legislation or when we say professional code of practice, they are basically a set of standards or guidelines which care providers must adhere to in order to ensure that their services being provided, which are safe, they are effective, and they are of quality in terms of meeting the standards as set by CQC. So when we look at legislation and when we look at professional code of practice, this is why is this being brought into this particular sector as an important part, is because this helps in shaping how the provision of health and social care services are delivered to the members of public in the UK. These services are then meeting some of the standards and guidelines which have been set. And these standard and guidelines, what do they ensure? The question that you should be asking is, what do they ensure? They should be ensuring that the services being provided are safe. That means if I go for a blood test, if I go for say, for example, a surgery, the surgery or the blood test, or any sort of surgical procedure that I'm undergoing, or if I'm undergoing a treatment for an illness, then that treatment being provided by the National Health Service should be safe. It should have been approved to a certain standard in terms of quality. It should be effective in helping meet me and my requirements of getting well or getting back onto my feet. And then last but not the least, they should conform to some sort of a quality standard set by the Care Quality Commission. Now, all these things which are, in aspects of ensuring that the health and social care provision, which is provided through the NHS and various other authorities, are, safe, effective, and are basically delivered to the members of public. And the practitioners, people who work within this sector are then very well trained to be able to, deliver these services. That is what is requirement in terms of ensuring, the main aim or objective of having this legislation or, the professional code of practice. Now, there are lots of different legislations that we will need to go through. One of the key bits, if you recall, that we had gone through last session was the Health and Social Care Act, of 2012. That was the most important provision that we looked at, when we talked about important piece of legislation which is relevant to the health and social care sector. So the Health and Social Care Act of 2012 was a major act introduced by the National Health Service, which basically looked at reforming how care services were, being delivered and provided to the members of public. Now, this act, when it was introduced, it also created what are called commissioning bodies who were responsible for overseeing the provision of how care is provided in local areas. That means surgeries, pharmacies, by establishing new regulation for care providers in care homes, for example. Now, when we look at this particular slide, as you can see, there are some of the other, key legislations which I've, mentioned. One is the Health and Safety Act. We have the Food Safety Act. We have the Food Regulations Act. We have the Mental Health Capacity Act. We also have the, various other bodies that we looked at, professional bodies, which there are 18 or 19 such bodies. I don't know how many of you recall that we covered last time. General Medical Council, the Nursery Midwifery Council. We looked at the HCPC. So there were brief details which were covered in the slides. For each of this key body, I had created one slide, the Healthcare Professional Council, HCPC. So these are bodies which are professional bodies which are responsible for creating what are called codes of practice, professional codes of practice, which are basically mirrored on the key bits of legislation which are introduced by the government. So when the government introduces legislation, the professional bodies are responsible for then incorporating the key bits of legislation into what is called a code of practice, guidelines, and obviously policies, which are then adhered to or implemented within any sort of a care setting or any sort of when I say care setting, I mean any sort of a place wherein care services are being provided to members of public. So they would include care homes, nurseries, it'll include, hospitals, A&E departments, surgeries, general, GP surgeries, pharmacies, any sort of setting where social care services, healthcare services are being provided to the members of public. Now, when we look at the key bits of legislation, in terms of, let's say, health and social care sector. So if we look at key legislations in this particular sector, specifically, this is a, slide which I have mentioned, which covers some of them in detail. Now, we will go into, they list out as names, and what we'll do is go into some of the details now. Now, the first and foremost that I want to get into is, say, for example, the what I want to do is go into a particular one that is something that we need to be aware of. So let me just reorder some part of this. So let's start with, let's say, I'm going to put this across as the Health and Social Care Act of 2012. Now, this is the first one that we want to look at, because what we would want to do is understand why is this something which was introduced, and why is it very important as far as understanding this bit of legislation is concerned. So when we look at the Health and Social Care Act in particular, we are talking about an act which basically looks at giving us a very good understanding on how these health and social care services are essentially delivered to the members of public. So when I look at this as a piece of legislation, which was introduced in 2012 and it came into force in 2013, this act revolutionized the way the National Health Service works. So what it did was it introduced major changes in the delivery of these services in the UK and to the members of public. Now, what changes were introduced? Number one, the first change this act introduced was it created what is called CCGs, Clinical Commissioning Groups. Now, these clinical commissioning groups were groups which were basically consisting of healthcare professionals such as doctors, nurses, and they were brought into and made responsible for planning of how healthcare services are delivered to the local populations. Now, taking out a policy or creating an act in parliament is one thing, but how do we ensure that these policies, acts, and everything are then, delivered to the members of public, to you and me in Manchester, for example, or somebody in Birmingham, or somebody else in, say, Scotland, or in a particular city in Cardiff? They established that there is a key requirement that healthcare professionals such as doctors, nurses, healthcare workers, occupational therapists, various different types of practitioners need to be included in planning and delivering of these services to local population. The second thing which this act did was it basically abolished what are called PCTs, primary care trust. Now, primary care trusts were essentially responsible for commissioning healthcare services earlier to CCGs being introduced. And the reason why they were abolished was that this was a very bureaucratic system, which basically had created a bigger or a fatter structure of management layer within the NHS. And what the CCG did was it abolished that, and it basically ensured that people who deliver service, nurses, care workers, social care workers, doctors, GPs, are the ones which are responsible for also planning these side of things. Then it also introduced what are called health and well-being boards. So if I look at health and well-being boards, these boards were essentially created where local authorities were brought into being stakeholders, and along with the CCGs, they were able to understand and assess the needs of the local populations to be able to provide service. Now, this act also introduced greater competition and choice in healthcare system in terms of provision. Now, the reason why this was done was that the NHS, as it is expanding on a population and the needs at which our services are required for the population, it also ensures that there is a fair coverage between private and public sector as far as the delivery of these services is concerned. So this greater competition and choice in healthcare provision meant that the Act introduced new regulations that allow, competition between providers of healthcare. And last but not the least, it also ensured that there is an involvement of patients in their own care. That means there was an act which was established, which basically ensured that independent consumer champions can work and promote the interest of patients in public health and social health, sector. That means voice of customer was also introduced when we look at this particular act. Now, this act changed, obviously it introduced a lot of things, but there were a series of changes which swept across the board when this particular act was introduced. And this particular act, when it was introduced, also ensured that these changes, when they were introduced within the health and social care sector, ensured that, there is voice of customer, the people who provide care, and then the local authorities. So they became custodians of, how the provision of these services would be provided to, the health and social care workers. Now, there is a very good handout which I have uploaded, on this act in particular. Reason being that this is one of the main acts that you need to be able to understand, and this has been downloaded from the .gov website. And this particular act, when you look at, ensure this particular handout or a 2-page PDF, which I've put up on the screen right now, is a fact sheet which talks about some of these changes which have been introduced, when the introduction of this particular act was done in 2012. Now, the reason I put it this way is that, and I'll show you the screenshot, this is something that you need to read and understand, because this is one of the things that you are expected to know when you work within the National Health Service or any such profession within the health and social care sector. So this 2-page handout actually summarizes the overview of the Act, the key changes which were introduced, and what this Act actually entails when it is implemented within a care setting. When I say a care setting, a care home, a hospital, or a GP surgery, and it's a good 10-minute read, and it'll give you a lot of good understanding in terms of, why this is an important act and how this actually then made changes to the overall health and social care structure within the UK. Now, in terms of, let's put it this way, going forward, let's look at some of the other important bits of legislation as well. Now, the other important bit of legislation that we want to look at is what is called the CARE Act. So one is the Health and Social Care Act of 2012, and then we look at what is called the CARE Act, of 2014. And this particular act, when we talk about, in general, say, for example, when we talk about in general about the CARE Act of 2014, it basically sets out a legal framework for social care and support services in England and Wales. Now, this act was introduced primarily to promote well-being and independence of adults who require care and they have support needs. And this act ensures that high-quality care is tailored to meet their individual needs. So when I talk about the CARE Act in general, what we are looking at is the CARE Act being an act specifically related to social care and support for adults in England. And this is again an important piece of provision which was introduced in 2014. And this ensured that there are new duties which were assigned to local authorities in terms of ensuring that the health and well-being of adults are taken care of when it comes to support and their care needs. So this takes into account physical, mental, and emotional needs, as well as the social and economic circumstances of the individuals requiring, those needs. So when we talk about social care and when we talk about housing support, if we feel that people do not have adequate access to, let's say, housing facilities, then this is an important piece of legislation which essentially ensures, that these social care services are provided, by the, local authorities. So if I put this across to you in a bit of a handout, which will overall, also be a bit of a summary in terms of how the CARE Act, sets out this legal framework. This is also an important piece of legislation that you need to understand. And that is what, again, is available as a bit of a handout, which I'll show you right now, that you would be able to access from Moodle. And this is the second most important piece of legislation that you need to be aware of and, know in general when we talk about, let's say the health and social care, acts, and in terms of some of the acts and legislations that we talk in general about. So let me just show you this particular handout as well. And this handout that you are going to be able to look at would also give you information in regards to, maybe some additional reading and a nice summary in terms of what this act essentially, stands for. So if I just share my screen. So when you look at the presentation, that's the CARE Act, and I've added 2 slides essentially to talk about what this is looking at doing. This is basically related, as I mentioned to you, a framework for support and social care services. This act, obviously involves local authorities, and it makes their role critical in terms of ensuring that anything which is related to a person's support, whether it's in terms of physical, mental, or emotional support, and it takes into account social and economic circumstances of the individual when planning for these support services to be delivered to the members of public. So there is a particular handout which will be something that you will be able to see, and that handout essentially would primarily be focusing on showing you a bit of a summary with regards to this particular act, which is the CARE Act of 2014. Important piece of legislation again, and this is what I would ensure that you go through in particular when you look at the details of some of the acts that we are discussing in relation to the learning outcome too. So this will be labeled as Care Act of 2014, and that should be something that you should also be aware of. So we've looked at two in particular, the Health and Social Care Act of 2012, and then we've looked at the details of the Care Act of 2014. Now, the third piece of legislation that we want to look at is basically the Mental Health Act of 2005. Now, this particular Mental Health Capacity Act of 2005, again, is an important piece of legislation as far as, acts are concerned. This act was passed in 2005 for England and Wales, and it outlines how decisions should be made on behalf of people who lack the mental capacity to make their own decisions. So imagine a person who has dementia or Alzheimer's disease, and they are incapacitated in terms of being able to make their own decisions. Now, this act, which is the Mental Health Capacity Act, then ensures that decisions, when they are made, they have a very clear legal framework. And these decisions, when they are made on behalf of someone, a person who is not having the capacity to be able to make or take decisions, then are done in such a way that it ensures that the decisions being taken are in the best interest of that particular individual. Now, this act defines what is mental capacity, and as an ability, what are the decisions that need to be taken as and when required to ensure the support and well-being. One is to ensure well-being, and the other is to provide support to that individual for which these decisions are being taken. So this is also an important piece of legislation, because sometimes when decisions are taken, these decisions are taken for individuals who lack the capacity of making the decision. And when the decision is taken or are made, they are then related to a particular framework. And the Act also provides for an appointment of a person who is going to act as a decision maker, for the person who's, for example, in this case, a person who's on whose behalf these decisions are being taken. And this person will be, established in a capacity wherein it has court jurisdiction. And if there are any appeals or any complaints which are raised, then there is a way wherein the court can get involved to ensure that the person's rights and interests are taken into consideration while this decision-making process is being done. So when we look at this particular act, again, there will be a particular document that you'll be able to see on what you call Moodle, and this particular document would basically substantiate some part of your understanding in terms of what is the Mental Capacity Act of 2005. Now, it's an important piece of legislation, obviously, simply because if we do see lots of people when they have accidents, or if they have degenerative conditions like dementia or Alzheimer's disease, then in those cases what you would generally see is that people in this particular capacity or having these conditions would not be having the capacity to make decisions. And when decisions have to be made on their behalf, this would be done using a particular legal framework, and a person will be appointed, and that person will have the capacity to be able to make take into account decisions being done which are going to be in the interest of the individual, and will also ensure that his or her individual rights are protected from a point of view of ensuring that the support being provided is meeting the requirements of that particular individual. Now, after this, we look at some of the other important bits of legislation, things like the health and safety legislation. Now, Health and Safety Act, when we talk about, is an act which primarily, would be, for example, required to ensure that if there are people which work within a particular place, then employers, in this case, the National Health Service, or say a care home, if it is under the jurisdiction of the local authority or a private provider, then the premises being used and the the conditions in which workers or staff work have to be maintained in such a way that they are not put at any harm. So when we talk about the health and safety legislation, the Health and Safety Act of 1974, it basically lays out clear legal requirements for employers to be able to provide a safe working environment for employees, staff, contractors, and this would be in a particular health and social care setting. So this piece of safety legislation, was obviously overhauled and revised, in 2016, I think. And when we talk about the Health and Safety Act, of 1974, when it was originally introduced, it laid out certain specific legal responsibilities for employers to ensure that there is health and safety within the workplace for its employees or staff or people who work. And there were some general responsibilities put on employers to make sure that they take into account health, safety, and welfare of the employees, staff, contractors who are working in those premises. Now, this act sometimes is also referred to as HSWA in short, Health and Safety Act, HASWA. So some of you who are aware of this particular act, I think when we work within the health and social care sector, one of the important bits of short training that we do within the organization is undergo the health and safety, training. And this particular act, HSWA is also, as it's called, ensures that you understand as an employee what is your responsibility and how do you take care of your own health and safety, and also the health and safety of others when you're working in a public workplace. Now, you are required by law to be able to cooperate with your employers on health and safety standards and matters of health and safety. And if there are any hazards or unsafe conditions, then you are required legally by law to report these conditions to the health and safety executive, which is HSE, the body which maintains and regulates this particular legislation. And they also provide guidelines essentially, which will ensure that, all places of work in the UK, including factories, offices, healthcare providers, facilities, hospitals, A&E, they meet a certain compliance. And this compliance ensures safety of employees, workers, or any such person, contractor person working within those premises to, obviously have what is called safe working conditions, and they are not put into, harm's way. Now, one of the other parts of this act, which can work in conjunction with health and safety, is the Safeguarding Act. Now, when we look at the Safeguarding Act, the Safeguarding, Act in particular is introduced in conjunction with the Health and Social Care Act of 2012. And this has most of the guidelines given, wherein safeguarding refers to, the process through which we are protecting children, vulnerable adults from any sort of abuse, neglect, harm, or exploitation. Now, abuse can be in the form of harm, neglect, or exploitation, but this act is a signature act which basically ensures that, that when we use the word safeguarding, we are also ensuring that, anybody which can be put into harm's way because of the because of abuse, and that could be in the form of, neglect, it could be in the form of harm, or it could be in the form of, verbal abuse. There are different types of abuses. I don't know. Do you know how many? How do we classify abuse, and how many different types are there? Any idea? All right. There are, go on.
Different types of abuse, like emotionally, physical, financial abuse. There's many.
That is correct. So
yeah,
that is correct. So there are various different types of abuse. There could be 10 different types: physical abuse, sexual abuse, financial abuse, institutional abuse. You could have, abuse which is primarily emotional abuse, as you rightly said. So the reason why Safeguarding Act was introduced was primarily to ensure that people are not put into any sort of harm's way by three main conditions. One is abuse, neglect, and exploitation. Now, this act works in conjunction with Health and Safety Act, the Human Rights Act, and also the NHS constitution, which basically looks at ensuring that every individual working and receiving any sort of service within or from any organization within the National Health Service is not put into harm's way or is not at risk of any sort of exploitation, discrimination, or abuse or neglect from any member of staff, employers, or any such organization which is basically delivering this service. So this is again an important piece of act, but it works in conjunction with some of the other acts that we're going to talk about, and they would be safeguarding, obviously health and safety. We are looking at Discrimination Equalities Act or Discrimination Act, and then the NHS Constitution. Now, there is again a small handout which I have created, and this handout, essentially talks about, if I just briefly show it to you, also talks about in the context of, what is safeguarding, and then which particular acts does it work or directly relate to when it comes to ensuring that people are not put into harm's way, they are not discriminated against, and also they are protected from abuse, neglect, or exploitation. So this handout would basically be looking at providing you some bit of details in regards to an important piece of legislation that we talk about, which is the Safeguarding Act. Now, what we also want to understand is that when we look at some of these acts, we are also, looking at understanding how some of the other acts work in conjunction with, the Health and Safety Act and the Safeguarding Act in general, because they would bring in services or maybe may require closer coordination and working, with other departments to be able to ensure that people are not put into harm's way or vulnerable people are protected. And last but not the least, they are not exploited in any way, shape or form to be able to take an advantage of. Now, apart from this, if I look at going into some of the other important pieces of legislation, what we want to also look at is the Human Rights Act of 1998. So if I go into that and then basically show, say, for example, just quickly switching over now so that we are able to see this bit as well with regards to safeguarding. So 1 second, 6 principles of safeguarding, which I'll introduce. And so the CARE Act that we want to talk about, Mental Health Care Act. Okay. Okay, so here we go. I'm going to try and upload a refreshed copy of the presentation, on Moodle after this session. I've just reorganized some of the slides here, just to make sure that, they are a bit more in line in terms of how we are discussing. So after the HASWA, we went into, some of the other acts which could be related to the Health and Safety Act. One of them is safeguarding. So just brought this slide a bit forward. What we've discussed, why is it important, how does it relate to the CARE Act, and then details of, safeguarding principles, which are 6 in general. And then it is closely working with the Health and Safety Executive to be able to ensure that, people are safeguarded both at their workplace and also ensuring that there are clear responsibilities laid out for both employers and employees. Now, the Mental Health Care Act was initially introduced in 1983, and then it was, updated in 2005. And when we talk about the Mental Health Care Act, as I've explained to you, and I've also ensured that you have a handout, this particular act, in general, ensures and provides guidelines primarily, as I mentioned to you, to basically ensure that people, when they are incapacitated in terms of making decisions, And if there are decisions being made for them, then the people who are making the decisions are following a legal framework. And obviously, this legal framework ensures that the person or the authority making that decision has jurisdiction to be able to, ensure that the decisions being taken are being taken into account, keeping in mind the person's, let's say, independence. The decisions being taken are made on behalf of the person who they ensure that these decisions essentially are going to be benefiting that individual, if I put it this way, rather than the other way around. So somebody who is authorized to make decisions on that basis follows a legal framework, make sure that the decisions being taken are being taken in the best interest of the individual in terms of the care being provided, and ensuring that the decisions are beneficial for the person in the long run. Now, some of the other acts that we look at, which are important as far as, the health and social care sector is concerned. These acts typically tend to be the Food Safety Act of 1990. Now, when we talk about the Food Safety Act of 1990, this was an act introduced in 1990 by the Parliament. And this law provides the framework for all food-related legislations in our country. So it sets out responsibilities for food businesses, operators, local authorities, and it establishes a range of offenses which could be related to when production, supply, or sale of food is done, or, in this case, the provision of food services is being done within the National Health Service. Now, the main objective of this act is to ensure that the food that is given is actually, or produced, is safe to eat, it is properly labeled, and it also meets the quality standards as set by the Foods Agency, in the UK. Now, under this act, basically, local authorities have the power to be able to inspect food premises. They have the power to be able to endorse food and safety regulations, and it also can impose penalties if there is non-compliance, found with regards to, the rules not being followed. So this act overall ensures that the UK's food supply is safe, and consumers can have the confidence, that whatever food they are eating is, something which is meeting certain key regulations of the Food and Safety Act of 1990. And when food is served in, say, in National Health Service, or in, for example, within the health and social care sector, this legislation actually ensures that all caterers, which are providing services to hospitals, are providing information to patients, staff, and visitors about the labeling of food, the contents of food, and if there are any specific allergens or anything that they need to be aware of when we talk about in this context, with regards to the health and safety of patients receiving, food and food-related provisions within the hospitals when you're undergoing, surgery or clinical procedures. And after that, you get food, which is, obviously helping you to get better, and obviously, being provided as a service within, say, the hospital. So this act, will ensure that, food safety and hygiene policy, which is a part and parcel of, the National Health Service, is to ensure that, this particular bit, this act basically ensures that the food being provided in hospitals to patients, or, any sort of a care setup like a care home, are meeting those particular, guidelines. So again, an important piece of legislation when we talk about, a piece of legislation in the UK as far as, health and safety and health and social care sector is concerned. So again, something that you need to be aware of, and you need to be aware of from a point of view of how it relates to when we talk about the National Health Service or any sort of setting in which food is being served through food catering agencies, and they have to comply with this particular legislation to ensure that the food is labeled, food is essentially safe, and it is making sure that when they provide these services to any of the setups within the National Health Service and the health and social care sector, it meets the hygiene regulations set by the NHS Foundation and NHS Trust Foundation in terms of being served to the patients or members of public within hospitals. Then you also have another important piece of provision, which I would bring forward on the slide, which is the Human Rights Act, which is basically related in general to, the rights that you have as an individual. So when I talk about, say, for example, the Human Rights Act in general, and related to the, there are lots of different articles within the Human Rights Act. There are, I think, 13 articles within the Human Rights Act. And when we in general talk about this particular act, what are the main points of this act? The main points of this act is that this is a law which was passed by the UK Parliament, and it gives legal protection to your human rights. That means you have a right to fair trial. Assuming, you are looking at, say, for example, if you are getting services from public authorities or local authorities or government departments, and you feel that, there are places wherein you are feeling that you do not get the right service, you are not treated equally, or you're not treated with fairness, and you're not given respect, then in those cases, you can use the Human Rights Act as a piece of legislation which allows you to, be able to rely on the rights and freedoms that are set in this particular law or an act. And this allows you to act against public authorities, including government departments, local authorities, police, and other public bodies which are responsible for providing health and social care services. Now, this act also places obligation on local authorities in a way that it ensures that people who are, receiving services are able to then, look at receiving them in a particular way. And when I say in a particular way, it means that the courts in the UK defend the rights of the individual and the members of public, and ensure that if they are receiving services from the government, any sort of government department, any sort of public organization, local council authorities, they are being treated equally, fairly, and with dignity and respect. And this particular act ensures that you are able to exercise your freedom of, exercise your freedom essentially, and your rights. And in such cases, if you feel your rights have been breached, then you have a way through which you can actually exercise the UK law and go take the local authority or the concerned authority to court to ensure that you are being, treated in fairness. And obviously, you have been given the dignity and the right, which is what this particular act actually provides. So again, on this act, obviously these all acts are very big pieces of legislation. So my aim of taking you through, this particular learning outcome is to make you understand what are these individual pieces of legislation. And we need to be aware of how these pieces of legislation can actually, be invoked. And you should have a bit of an idea into what these acts are and what they essentially stand for. So again, for this particular act, I have a handout which I'm going to make available on Moodle, and this is called the Human Rights Act of 1998. And a brief summary of what this act does is something that is available when you essentially look at reading this particular handout, which is a Word document on Moodle. Now, there is so if I look at switching over now back to the presentation, there is another piece of legislation that we want to understand, and that is primarily the Manual Handling Operation Regulation of 1992. Now, as you know that within the NHS and when we look at the health and social care sector, there are people working in different roles. There are people who work within catering. There are people who work within the laundry side of things. There are people who work within, operations side of hospitals, A&E departments and others, wherein there is manual handling, transportation, or, lifting of load, pushing of load, putting of load, carrying of load is required. So this particular act, was introduced in 1992, and it set very clear guidelines in terms of how to deal with risks which can arise from manual handling of, articles. Now, this was done primarily to ensure that there is, people are not put into harm's way when they look at dealing with material. So it could be hazardous material. As you know, a lot of waste gets produced within the hospitals and some of these places. So anything which is going to be hazardous, for example, needles, syringes, PPE, you look at medication, you look at, when people undergo clinical procedure, there is a lot of clinical waste which gets, created. And this has to be, there are people who handle and dispose of this waste. So obviously people who handle and dispose of this waste, or agencies which work within different departments to, look at this, they are looking at doing manual handling. And in some cases, manual handling could be weight related, moving the patients around stretchers, beds, but in some cases, hazardous substances, if they are being taken out as waste, then the handling of those and the operations of handling of those have to be done with a reasonable, amount of safety. And for this, the manual handling operations regulation was introduced in 1992. Now, this basically looks at ensuring that if any sort of risk is arising from handling of hazardous material, then it is mitigated. It also ensures that if you're doing manual handling in terms of lifting of, goods or equipment, then it sets various standards that ensure that these manual handling tasks, wherever possible that you undertake, do not put person's life at risk. And then there are steps it, proposes. The Act proposes which reduce the risk of injury from any sort of manual handling of hazardous substances. And it is employers' responsibility to be able to provide training and, I would say training and development to ensure that people are aware of how to deal with this. When they are dealing in these kind of situations, they are knowing and they are aware of how to deal with, any sort of equipment. Now, if I put it this way, by giving an example, that if there was a new piece of equipment being introduced in the hospital, like an X-ray machine or a MRI scanner, sorry, then in that case, it is the responsibility of the employer to ensure that proper training is provided to people who would be essentially handling and working with that equipment, so that they are not put at any sort of risk. And that would be covered under, the manual handling operations regulation of 1992. So these are important pieces of legislation which employers need to understand, and they need to be able to implement these in terms of guidelines to assess risks, to minimize risks, and to ensure that appropriate measures are put in place, so that when people are dealing or using these aids, equipments, any sort of mechanical devices, then they are being advised to reduce any need for manual handling. And in cases, if it is required to be done, then proper training is given to employees, which is staff, nurses, social care workers, any sort of operators or workers which is working within this sector, in terms of how to carry out these tasks safely. And that is what this particular piece of legislation, ensures. Now, in addition to this, you would also look at, the NHS Act of 2010. So when I talk about the NHS Act of 2010, or essentially 2006, when it was introduced, what we also look at is this piece of legislation, when it was introduced primarily to set out a framework of how health and social care services in England in particular would be provided. So it also looks at building up on the role of the Secretary of State of Health for Health and the various bodies which work within the NHS and the healthcare professionals who work within this particular sector. So this particular act, when we talk about, is again important because this consolidated all previous legislations of the National Health Service, prior to 2006 for England and Wales, and introduced a new set of provisions which were aimed at modernizing and improving the delivery of health and social care services to the members of public. Now, there are lots of bits of important things which this act essentially introduced. And if we look at understanding the NHS Act in particular, some of the key provisions which this act introduced was it established the NHS Foundation Trust, which is a semi-autonomous body. That means it is a body which is not controlled by the government fully. It is semi-autonomous. That means it is autonomous in its functions of doing audits and, in terms of ensuring budgeting and operational side of things, which are, in terms of how operations have to be carried out. Or when I say operation, I don't mean literally operation, but I mean how the NHS as a body functions as a whole is something which is decided by this particular trust. It also introduced the quality principles. It also led to the creation of CQC, which is the Care Quality Commission, and the establishment of local health boards, which I mentioned earlier, which are responsible for planning in conjunction with the clinical commissioning groups, the CCGs, for how the services are delivered to the local populations, or how services are delivered through the NHS and the route of NHS and the NHS organizations in a particular area. Now, this act is important also because it changes the way some of the other professional bodies, also provide service. For example, the General Medical Council, the National Dentistry Council. We look at some of the others, councils like the Healthcare Professional Council, and it also influences them to strengthen, patient public involvement in planning of some of these services which are delivered, to the members of public. So again, on the PowerPoint presentation, I haven't, put a lot of details, but this particular handout, which is available on Moodle, again, if I show this to you very briefly, you would see that this would list out and detail, giving you information on what this act is all about and why this was introduced and how it basically works in conjunction with some of the other, professional bodies like HCPC, the GMC, the Nursing and Midwifery Council, and it ensures that, they are also taking into account the guidelines and policy-related guidelines which have been introduced under this particular act. So, as you can see, some bits of codes and practice, how it influences the HCPC, the Nurses and Midwifery Council, and the General Medical Council. So, this particular presentation today, or the discussion today, helps you kind of understand in a bit of detail, what are the important pieces of legislation in particular which are required to be followed within the health and social care sector, and what kind of an impact that they have on the codes of practice and in terms of delivery of these services to the members of public. Now, any questions on what we've discussed so far? Any questions?
No, at the moment.
All right. Now, one thing which we will do in today's session would be to also look at some additional reading. So what I've done towards the end is, I've created some links here, which are going to also, apart from the handouts that I provided, will also be looking at providing you details of, some of the acts which are associated with legislation and important part of it and applicability of it to the health and social care sector. So this helps us, to come to a bit of a close with regards to our discussion today on Learning Outcome 2. And what I would encourage you to do is basically look at going through the updated version of this slide, because I have rearranged some of the slides on this presentation. And in general, there are about 6 or 7 word handouts that you will see, which are going to be the important handouts primarily for the legislations or acts that you need to be aware of, which will help you, in detail understanding this learning outcome, which is how current legislation and professional codes of practice impact the health and social care provision. Is that okay? Good stuff. So
Okay.
I will catch up with you in next week, which will be Monday, the 15th, wherein we'll cover Learning Outcome 3, and 16th, which is Tuesday, wherein we'll do the assignment discussion for this particular unit. Now, any questions at this stage, you're happy to take. Go ahead.